What separates us from the darkness? Greta took the plate with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Around the room, the atmosphere shifted. Not entirely, not completely, but enough. Some of the volunteers who'd held back stepped forward. Conversations resumed. The American Legion veteran sat down at a table and gestured for Greta to join him. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. His name was Robert Callahan, and over the next hour, he told her about his grandson Michael. A boy who'd loved baseball and physics, who'd wanted to cure cancer, who'd written poetry in his spare time and sent it home in letters stained with mud from French foxholes. Greta listened and shared her own losses. Her sister Maria, her colleague Johanna who'd disappeared after criticizing the regime, her neighbor's son who'd been 14 when he was conscripted and never came home. We're all victims of the same insanity, Robert said finally. Different sides, different flags, but the same machine that chews up the young and spits out corpses. I hate what your country did. I hate what my country had to do in response. But I don't hate you. Sitting here, grieving your own losses. That would be too easy, and nothing about this is easy. When it came time to leave that day, Robert stood at the community center door and shook each woman's hand. When he reached Greta, he pressed something into her palm. A small photograph of a young man in uniform, smiling at the camera with his whole life ahead of him. On the back, written in careful script, Michael Callahan. Remember him. Remember all of them. I will, Greta promised. Always. The photograph joined the seed packets in her canvas bag, treasures from a world she was slowly learning existed. A world where enemies could become something more complicated, where grief could build bridges instead of walls, where the hardest thing wasn't surviving but learning to live with purpose after survival. The next week brought Greta's promised visit to Dorothy's classroom. She'd been terrified during the intervening days, practicing what she'd say, discarding speeches that sounded too defensive or too apologetic or too political. In the end, she decided to simply tell the truth, her truth limited and specific but honest. Dorothy's junior class consisted of 23 students, mostly 16 and 17 years old, faces fresh with the innocence that American youth had somehow maintained despite the war. They sat in neat rows, notebooks open, pens ready, watching Greta with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to carefully neutral attention. Good morning, Greta began in English, the words slow and careful. Dorothy had helped her prepare, correcting pronunciation, suggesting phrases. My name is Greta Hoffmann. I am mathematics teacher from Dresden, Germany. I am 30 years old, but I feel much older. She paused, gathering courage, then continued. I want to tell you about my city. Dresden was beautiful, we call it Florence on the Elbe. Architecture, art, music, culture. I teach at girls' school near the Altstadt, the old city. 40 students, age 13 to 16. Smart girls, curious girls. Girls who want to be doctors, engineers, teachers, writers. A girl in the front row raised her hand. Were they Nazis? The question landed like a stone in still water. Dorothy started to intervene, but Greta held up her hand. Honest question deserves honest answer. Some were in Hitler Youth was required. Some families were true believers. Some families pretended, for safety. My students were children, learning what they were taught, believing what adults told them. Like all children everywhere. She paused. I was in party too, not because I believed, but because I could not teach without membership. This does not excuse me. This is just truth. She talked for 30 minutes, describing Dresden before the war, the Frauenkirche with its sandstone dome, the Semperoper Opera House, the Zwinger Palace with its galleries and gardens. She described teaching mathematics to girls who giggled over boys and struggled with geometry and brought her apples from their family gardens. She described the slow tightening of restrictions, the disappearance of Jewish colleagues, the fear that settled over everything like fog. Then she described February 13th, 1945. She kept it factual, not sensational. The air raid sirens, the waves of bombers, the firestorm that consumed the city. She didn't describe the worst horrors, the melted bodies, the rivers choked with corpses. These were children. They didn't need nightmares. But she told them enough. The Frauenkirche stood for one day after the bombing, she said quietly, like it was refusing to accept what had happened. Then it fell. My school was destroyed. I never learned what happened to most of my students. Some I know died. Some I hope survived. She looked directly at the class. When you see pictures of destroyed German cities, remember, teachers lived there. Students lived there. Bakers and doctors and children lived there. Not all were Nazis. Not all chose this. Many of us are trying to understand how we let it happen. A boy in the back raised his hand. But you did let it happen. You followed Hitler. You invaded other countries. You killed millions of Jews. How do we forgive that? You don't, Greta said simply. You don't forgive the unforgivable. But maybe you can separate the nation from individuals. Maybe you can hold me accountable for my silence, my cowardice, my failure to resist, while also recognizing that I did not personally invade Poland or operate death camps. Both things are true. I am guilty of not stopping evil, and I am not personally responsible for every evil committed in Germany's name. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, difficult and raw and occasionally angry, but always honest. A girl whose brother had died at Bastogne said she was glad Dresden burned. A boy whose father was stationed in Berlin said he hoped Germans would starve. Another girl, daughter of German immigrants, said quietly that her grandmother had been Jewish and had escaped in 1938, leaving family behind who had not escaped. My grandmother won't talk about Germany, the girl said. She says Germany is dead to her. But I think she still mourns what it was before Hitler ruined it. She still makes Black Forest cake and sings German lullabies to my baby brother. I think she's trying to hold onto the good parts while grieving the destruction. That is all we can do, Greta agreed. Mourn what was lost, acknowledge what we did, and try to build something better from the ashes. After class, several students approached with questions, comments, or simply to look at her more closely, as if trying to reconcile this ordinary-looking woman with their images of the enemy. The girl whose brother had died at Bastogne came last, her face set in hard lines. I still hate Germany, she said flatly. But I guess I don't hate you. I don't know what to do with that. Hold both truths, Greta suggested. Hate what was done. Try not to hate individuals who are trying to do better. It's complicated. It should be complicated. Simple answers don't work for complicated situations. The girl nodded slowly, then walked away without another word. Greta watched her go and felt exhausted down to her bones. Speaking truth was harder than she'd expected, more draining than physical labor, more painful than hunger, but also necessary, also perhaps healing. Dorothy drove her back to the camp that evening, taking the long route through the countryside so they could talk privately. The Missouri landscape rolled past. Farmland, forests, small creeks, the occasional house with lights glowing warm in the twilight. You did well, Dorothy said. That couldn't have been easy. Nothing is easy anymore, Greta replied. But today felt important. Those students, they saw me as human, not as representative of Germany, but as one person with one story. Maybe that's all we can do, one person at a time. My grandmother would have liked you, Dorothy said quietly. She left Bavaria in 1875, came to Missouri, married a farmer, raised 7 children. She used to tell me stories about the old country, the mountains, the festivals, the way her village looked at Christmas. She died in 1942, before Pearl Harbor, before everything went to hell. Sometimes I'm glad she didn't live to see what Germany became. But she also didn't live to see what Germany might become after, Greta pointed out. We don't know the ending yet. Maybe there's still hope for redemption. Do you believe that? Greta thought about Robert Callahan sharing his grandson's photograph, about Ruth giving her seeds, about the boy with candy, about Dorothy herself spending hours helping enemy prisoners feel human again. Yes, she said finally. I have to believe it. Otherwise, what's the point of surviving? The following week brought news that the war in the Pacific had ended. Japan had surrendered after the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The camp erupted in confused emotion. The American guards celebrated, whooping and hugging, planning their returns home. The German women felt the weight of it differently. Relief that the killing had stopped, horror at the new weapon that had ended it, and underneath everything the question, what happens to us now? Private Henderson came to their barracks that evening, his freckled face serious. Ladies, I got news. They're processing you for repatriation. Could be weeks, could be months, but you're going home. Back to Germany. Back to... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Back to what? Back to rubble and starvation and occupation? Back to the consequences of choices they'd made or failed to make. That night, Greta couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot, thinking about Dresden, about what might remain of her apartment, her school, her life. She thought about her brother Karl, last heard from in 1944, stationed on the Eastern Front. She thought about her sister-in-law Katrina and her niece Sophie, who would be 10 years old now if she'd survived. She thought about going home to face what her nation had done, what she had allowed through her silence. And she thought about Lebanon, Missouri, this small town that had shown her kindness when it had no obligation to do so, this place that had reminded her what normalcy looked like, what peace felt like, what hope could taste like when you'd forgotten its flavor. She got up and walked to the barracks window, looking out at the Missouri night. Stars filled the sky, undimmed by blackouts or bombing raids. In the distance, a dog barked. A car drove past on the road outside the camp. Ordinary sounds in an ordinary night. She pressed her forehead against the glass and whispered a prayer to whoever might be listening. Let me take this home. Let me remember that this exists. Let me build something good from the ruins. The final 2 weeks before repatriation moved with surreal speed. The camp administration organized a series of farewell visits to Lebanon, allowing the women to say goodbye to the people who'd become unlikely friends. Greta found herself in the community center one last time, surrounded by faces that had become familiar. Dorothy, Helen, Betty, Margaret from the bookstore, Ruth from the farm, Robert Callahan with his proud military bearing and wounded heart. They'd organized a small ceremony, awkward and well-intentioned, with speeches and gifts. Dorothy presented each woman with a book for Greta, a copy of Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, translated into German. So you can understand what we're trying to be, Dorothy said, even when we fall short. Ruth gave each woman a small cloth bag filled with seeds. More than before, enough to plant a small garden. Life continues, she said firmly. Remember that. Robert Callahan gave each woman a small American flag pin. Not to celebrate our victory, he explained in his careful German, but to remember that enemies can become friends, that peace is built person by person, not just government by government. The women had prepared their own gifts, though they had little to give. They'd spent hours in the camp, using donated fabric and thread, creating embroidered handkerchiefs. Simple work, but done with care. Each handkerchief bore a different design. Flowers for Ruth, books for Margaret, musical notes for Betty who loved to sing, a schoolhouse for Dorothy. When Greta presented hers to Dorothy, she'd also written a letter, translated with Private Henderson's help into English. Dorothy read it aloud, her voice catching. Dear Dorothy, you showed me that education is not just teaching facts, but teaching humanity. You showed me that former enemies can sit at the same table and share food, share stories, share grief. When I return to Germany, if I can find students to teach, I will tell them about a woman in Missouri who spoke German because she loved the language and the culture, even after war made that difficult. I will tell them that America is not perfect, but it tries. That Americans are not saints, but they can be kind. That peace is possible if we work for it. Thank you for seeing me as a person, not just as the enemy. I will carry that gift home with me. With gratitude and hope, Greta Hoffmann. There wasn't a dry eye in the community center. Even Robert Callahan wiped at his face with his handkerchief, muttering about allergies. Private Henderson translated the letter into English for those who didn't speak German, his voice thick with emotion by the end. Helen, the elderly woman who'd first asked Annalise about her son, stood and cleared her throat. I've been thinking about what we've done here, she said. Hosting these women, showing them our town, sharing our food. Some folks think we've been disloyal. But I think we've been doing the hardest work of all. It's easy to hate an enemy you never meet. It's much harder to maintain that hate when you've shared coffee and cookies with them, when you've heard their stories, when you've seen their humanity. She turned to address the German women directly. You go home now. You face difficult times. But take this with you. There are Americans who wish you well, who hope you'll rebuild, who believe that German culture is more than the Nazi years, that German people are more than their worst leaders. Plant those seeds Ruth gave you. Read those books. Remember that peace is built by ordinary people making ordinary choices to be kind. The farewell stretched long into the afternoon. Women who'd been strangers 8 weeks ago embraced like sisters. Addresses were exchanged, though mail service to Germany was uncertain and would remain so for years. Promises were made to write, to remember, to tell others about what had happened here in this small Missouri town. As they boarded the bus for the last time, Greta looked back at the group of Americans standing outside the community center, waving goodbye. Dorothy stood in front, her hand raised high, tears streaming down her face. Behind her, Ruth held her husband Tom's arm. Robert Callahan stood at attention, saluting them, not as enemies, but as fellow survivors of the war's long nightmare. The bus pulled away, and Greta watched Lebanon recede. The courthouse with its clock tower, the stores with their full windows, the park with its oak tree and memorial, the houses with whole roofs and painted walls. She memorized it all, knowing she might never see it again, knowing she needed to carry this vision back to the wasteland that Germany had become. Beside her, Annalise wept openly, clutching her handkerchief and the book she'd been given. "How can we go back?" she whispered. "How can we return to ruins after seeing this?" "We go back because we must," Greta replied, taking her friend's shaking hand. "We go back because Germany needs people who've seen what peace looks like, what prosperity looks like, what ordinary human kindness looks like. We go back to rebuild not just buildings but souls. Our own souls first, then maybe others." Margaret, sitting in the seat behind them, leaned forward. "Do you think we'll ever see them again? Dorothy, Ruth, any of them?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "I don't know," Greta admitted, "but I think what happened here will ripple outward. We'll go home and tell our stories. They'll stay here and tell theirs. Maybe those stories will change minds, open hearts, make peace seem possible instead of impossible. Maybe that's enough." The camp that night hummed with a different energy. Repatriation papers were being processed. Women sorted through their meager belongings, deciding what to take home, what to leave behind. Some cried with relief at the thought of returning. Others cried with fear of what they'd find. All of them carried the weight of uncertainty. Would there be homes to return to? Family members to reunite with? Any semblance of normal life? Greta organized her canvas bag carefully. The seed packets from Ruth, the book from Dorothy, the photograph of Michael Callahan, the American flag pin, letters she'd written but couldn't yet send, and a small notebook where she'd recorded everything. Every conversation, every kindness, every moment of hope. This notebook would be her testimony, her evidence that redemption was possible, that enemies could become something more. Private Henderson came to their barracks one last time before his own discharge. He'd be returning to his family's farm, he told them, taking over from his aging father, planting wheat and corn and living the quiet life he dreamed about during the war. He shook each woman's hand, his freckled face solemn. "Ma'am," he said to Greta, "I want you to know, I'm glad I met you, all of you. When I was drafted, I was taught to hate Germans, to see you as the enemy, nothing more. But you ladies, you showed me that people are just people, no matter what uniform they wear or what flag they fight under. I'll remember that, and I'll teach my kids that when I have them." "Thank you, Bobby," Greta said, using his first name for the first time. "Thank you for being kind when you didn't have to be. Thank you for driving us to Lebanon. Thank you for helping us remember we're human." He nodded, blinking rapidly, then turned and walked away before his emotions could overwhelm him. Through the window, Greta watched him climb into the Jeep and drive toward the camp gates, toward his own future, toward the farm and the life waiting for him. She wondered if he'd tell his children about the German women he'd guarded, about the town that had shown them mercy, about the strange summer when enemies had sat at the same table and broken bread together. The day of departure arrived gray and drizzling, the Missouri sky weeping as if mourning their leaving. They boarded a military transport truck that would take them to St. Louis, then a train to New York, then a ship back to Germany. The camp commander, a tired-looking colonel who'd been kind but distant, gave a brief speech about hoping they'd remember American fairness and would help rebuild Germany into a peaceful nation. As the truck pulled away from the camp, Greta looked back one final time. The barracks that had housed them stood empty now, awaiting the next group of displaced people, the next wave of war's refugees. She thought about all the women who'd passed through here, all the stories that had unfolded in those simple buildings, all the transformations that had occurred when enemies were forced to recognize each other's humanity. The journey to St. Louis took 6 hours, the landscape changing from farms to small towns to suburbs to city. But even St. Louis, larger and more industrial than Lebanon, showed no signs of war damage. Buildings stood intact. Bridges spanned the Mississippi River whole and functional. People walked the streets without fear, without the haunted look that Greta had seen in every German face since 1945. At the train station, they waited in a holding area, surrounded by other groups being repatriated, German POWs, displaced persons, refugees. Some were returning to Germany. Others were being sent to other occupied territories. All shared the same exhausted uncertainty, the same wondering about what came next. A young German soldier, maybe 25, sat near Greta on a bench. He'd lost his left arm below the elbow, the sleeve of his shirt pinned up neatly. He stared at nothing, his face blank with the 1,000-yard stare Greta had seen on too many soldiers, too many survivors. "Where are you from?" she asked gently. "Hamburg," he said, his voice flat. "You?" "Dresden." He nodded slowly. "Nothing left, I heard. Either city. Just rubble." "Then we'll rebuild," Greta said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "We'll clear the rubble stone by stone and build something new." He looked at her directly for the first time, and something flickered in his dead eyes. Maybe hope, maybe just curiosity. "You believe that? After everything?" "I have to," Greta replied. "I've seen what the alternative looks like. Continued bitterness, continued hatred, continued destruction. I've also seen what's possible when people choose differently. I spent 8 weeks in a small town in Missouri being shown kindness by people who had every reason to hate me. If they can choose mercy, we can choose to rebuild with purpose." The train journey to New York took 2 days, the landscape rolling past in endless variation. Forests and fields, mountains and rivers, small towns and large cities, all of it untouched by war, all of it existing in the blessed ordinary that Germans had forgotten was possible. Greta pressed her face to the window and tried to memorize it all, this vision of what peace looked like when it was allowed to flourish. In New York, they were processed through a massive facility where thousands of displaced persons waited for ships home. The bureaucracy was overwhelming. Forms to fill out, documents to verify, medical examinations to endure, interrogations about their activities during the war. Greta answered honestly. Teacher, factory worker, no party leadership position, no knowledge of atrocities beyond rumors, deeply ashamed of what her nation had done. The interrogator, a young American lieutenant with kind eyes, listened without judgment. "You know what you're going home to?" he asked. "Ruins," Greta said simply. "And you're going anyway? It's home, or what's left of it, and someone has to rebuild." He stamped her papers and handed them back. "Good luck, Miss Hoffmann. Germany's going to need people like you." The ship that would carry them home was a converted troop transport, crowded and uncomfortable but seaworthy. They boarded on a foggy morning, the Statue of Liberty visible in the distance, her torch raised high. Greta stood at the rail and looked at that statue for a long time, thinking about what it represented. Freedom, hope, new beginnings. America had all of those things, had protected them even through war. Germany would have to earn them back, slowly, painfully, through years of hard work and genuine change. As the ship pulled away from New York Harbor, America receding into fog and memory. Greta opened her notebook and began to write. She wrote about Lebanon, about Dorothy and Ruth and Robert Callahan. She wrote about Private Henderson and the boy with candy and the students in Dorothy's classroom. She wrote about whole roofs and stocked stores and farmland that stretched to the horizon, untouched by battle. She wrote about kindness when kindness wasn't deserved, mercy when mercy wasn't earned, hope when hope seemed impossible. And she wrote, finally, about the future, about returning to Dresden and finding whatever remained, about planting Ruth's seeds in whatever soil she could find, about teaching again if schools could be rebuilt, if students could be found, if anyone still believed in education after education had failed to prevent catastrophe, about telling her story to anyone who would listen, the story of how enemies had broken bread together, how Americans had shown her what peace looked like, how redemption might be possible if they worked for it. The crossing took 9 days, the North Atlantic gray and cold even in late summer. Many women spent the journey below deck, sick or frightened or simply unable to face the reality of what they were returning to. But Greta stayed on deck as much as possible, breathing the salt air, watching the endless ocean, preparing herself mentally for what awaited. On the 8th day, Annalise joined her at the rail, wrapped in a donated blanket against the wind. Her hands still shook, but perhaps a little less than before. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "So am I," Greta replied. "What if my son didn't survive? What if there's nothing left?" "Then we survive anyway," Greta said firmly. "We survive and we rebuild and we make sure this never happens again. That's all we can do." "Do you think they'll hate us?" Annalise asked. "The Americans who come to occupy Germany? Will they remember that we were shown kindness? Or will they just see us as the enemy?" "Some will hate us," Greta acknowledged. "Some will be kind, just like Germans. Some will accept responsibility and work for change, and some will deny everything and cling to old hatreds. We can't control others. We can only control ourselves." The 9th day dawned gray and miserable, with rain lashing the deck and wind howling through the rigging. But through the murk, someone shouted, "Land!" The women crowded to the rails, straining to see through the storm. There, emerging from the fog like a ghost, was the coast of Europe. Not the Europe they remembered, not the proud continent that had stood at the center of world civilization, but Europe broken and beaten, waiting to be remade. They docked at Bremerhaven, or what remained of it. The port had been bombed repeatedly, its facilities destroyed, its warehouses burned, its once busy docks now skeletal ruins. As they disembarked, shuffling down the gangplank with their meager possessions, Greta got her first real look at post-war Germany, and her heart broke all over again. The destruction was absolute. Block after block of rubble, buildings reduced to hollow shells, streets barely passable through debris. And the people, oh God, the people, hollow-eyed, skeletal, dressed in rags, moving through the ruins like ghosts haunting their own graves. Children with swollen bellies and vacant stares sat on piles of bricks. Old women pushed carts loaded with scavenged wood. Men missing limbs hobbled past on makeshift crutches. This was Germany. This was home. This was the consequence of following a madman into the abyss. The processing center was chaos. Hundreds of returning prisoners, displaced persons, refugees, all trying to get papers, find transportation, locate family members. Greta stood in line for 6 hours before reaching a harried clerk who barely looked at her papers before stamping them. "Dresden?" the clerk said when she stated her destination. "Good luck. Train lines are damaged. Might take you weeks. There's a refugee center on Berliner Straße. You can get temporary housing and food rations there." "What's left of Dresden?" Greta asked, though she dreaded the answer. The clerk finally looked up, his eyes old beyond his years. "Not much. The Frauenkirche is gone. Most of the Altstadt is flattened. Neustadt has some buildings standing. Population's maybe a third of what it was." He stamped another form. "Next." Greta found Annalise in the crowded hall, both of them clutching their papers like lifelines. "I'm going to try to get to Berlin first," Annalise said, her voice trembling. "My husband's family had a house there. Maybe someone survived." Maybe there's news of Dieter. They embraced. These two women who'd become sisters through shared trauma. Write to me, Greta said. Care of General Delivery, Dresden. If there's a post office left. If I can afford a stamp, Anneliese replied, trying to smile. If there's paper to write on. If anything resembling normal life still exists. They separated in the crowd, and Greta never saw her again. She heard, years later, that Anneliese had found her son. Alive, barely, in a hospital in Munich. But that day in Bremerhaven, they simply parted, two threads in the vast tapestry of displacement that covered Europe like a shroud. The journey to Dresden took 3 weeks. Train lines were broken, requiring long detours or walking between stations. Bridges were down, necessitating ferry crossings or wading through rivers. Roads were clogged with refugees, Germans fleeing the Eastern Territories, displaced persons searching for homes, former slave laborers trying to return to their countries, Allied military convoys moving through occupied zones. Greta walked most of the way, her canvas bag on her back, sleeping in train stations or refugee centers or, once, in a bombed-out church where the altar still stood but the roof was open to the sky. She shared what little food she had with others, and they shared theirs with her. She heard stories that made her earlier losses seem small. Entire families murdered, children separated from parents permanently, women raped repeatedly by occupying soldiers, men worked to death in labor camps. And everywhere, the same question: how did we let this happen? How did we allow evil to take root so deeply that it poisoned an entire nation? How do we come back from this? When Greta finally walked into Dresden, or into the wasteland that had once been Dresden, she stopped and wept. Nothing had prepared her for the totality of the destruction. The beautiful city she'd loved was simply gone. The Frauenkirch's blackened ruins rose from a sea of rubble like a broken tooth. The Semperoper was gutted. The Zwinger Palace was damaged beyond recognition. Her school. She walked to where it had stood, but couldn't even determine which pile of bricks had been the building. The apartment building where she'd lived was a hollow shell. The top 3 floors collapsed into the bottom 2. But the basement was accessible, and by some miracle, her few possessions stored there had survived. Photo albums, her mother's china, most of it broken, but a few pieces intact. Teaching materials, books. She sat among these remnants of her former life and wept until she had no tears left. But then she remembered Lebanon. She remembered Ruth's seeds, Dorothy's book, Robert Callahan's photograph. She remembered the boy with candy and Private Henderson's kindness and the whole roofs that stretched across Missouri. She remembered that peace was possible, that rebuilding was possible, that hope, however fragile, was possible. She emerged from the basement with her canvas bag and began to walk. The Soviet occupation zone was harsh. Food was scarce. Restrictions were severe. Suspicion was everywhere. But there were also signs of life returning. A makeshift market where people bartered goods. A water pump where neighbors gathered to gossip. A crew of women clearing rubble, brick by brick, singing work songs to maintain morale. Greta joined them. For weeks, she cleared rubble, her hands bleeding, her back aching, her spirit wavering but not breaking. And in the evenings, she talked with the other women about America, about Lebanon, about a small town that had shown her mercy. Some believed her. Some didn't. Some said she'd been brainwashed by American propaganda. But a few, a precious few, listened with hungry hearts and said, "Tell us more. Tell us what hope looks like." In early 1946, the Soviets began reopening schools. The need was desperate. An entire generation of children had missed years of education, learning nothing but propaganda and war. Teachers were scarce. Greta volunteered immediately, despite having to undergo intense political re-education, despite the suspicion that clung to anyone who'd been in the Nazi Party, despite the exhaustion that never left her bones. They gave her a classroom in a partially restored building, 35 students, ages 12 to 17, all of them traumatized, all of them hungry, none of them sure why learning mathematics mattered when the world had ended. On the first day, Greta stood before them and spoke honestly. "I failed you," she said. "Not you specifically, but your generation. I was a teacher before the war, and I taught what I was told to teach, said what I was told to say, and stayed silent when silence was safest. Because of that failure, mine and millions of others like me, you grew up in a nightmare. I cannot undo that. But I can promise you this. I will never lie to you again. I will teach you mathematics, yes, but I will also teach you to think, to question, to resist when resistance is necessary. I will teach you that the world is larger than Germany, that other nations exist, that former enemies can become friends. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out the photograph of Michael Callahan. This was an American soldier, killed fighting against Germany. His grandfather gave me this photograph and asked me to remember. So I remember Michael, who wanted to cure cancer. And I remember my student Helga, who wanted to be a doctor and died in the firestorm. And I remember all of them, all the young people on every side who were fed into the machinery of war and destroyed. I teach because someone must remember, because someone must make sure it never happens again. The students stared at her with their haunted eyes, and she saw in them the same desperate hunger for truth that she'd felt. One girl raised her hand, barely 15, thin as a rail, wearing clothes that were clearly scavenged from multiple sources. "Did the Americans hate you?" she asked. "When you were prisoner?" "Some did," Greta replied honestly. "They had every right to, but some showed me kindness instead. They taught me that hate is a choice, not an inevitability. That peace is built person by person, choice by choice, moment by moment. That's what I want to teach you, not just mathematics, but how to be human in a world that tried to destroy humanity." That spring, Greta planted Ruth's seeds in a small plot behind the school building. Some didn't germinate. The soil was poor, contaminated by chemicals from the firestorm. But some did. Carrots pushed through the earth. Bean plants climbed makeshift trellises. Tomatoes formed on scraggly vines. Her students tended the garden, and she taught them that life, stubborn and persistent, would continue. Years passed. Dresden slowly rebuilt. Greta continued teaching, training new teachers, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. She wrote letters to Dorothy, sporadic at first due to postal difficulties, then more regular as services improved. Dorothy wrote back, telling her about Lebanon, about her students, about America's own struggles to understand its role in the world. In 1961, when the Berlin Wall went up, Greta stood with her students, now young adults, some of them teachers themselves, and wept. Germany divided, perhaps permanently. Peace, but at what cost? Freedom, but only partial. Hope, but compromised. But even then, even in that dark moment, she remembered Lebanon. She remembered that walls could be crossed with kindness, that divisions could be bridged with understanding, that the work of peace was never finished, always ongoing, always necessary. In 1989, when the wall came down, Greta was 74 years old, retired but still vigorous, still teaching informally, still telling her story. She stood with her former students, some of them grandparents now, and watched young people dance on the rubble of division. And she thought about how it had all started with seeds. Literal seeds from Ruth, metaphorical seeds of hope planted by strangers who'd chosen mercy over vengeance. She never returned to America. Travel remained difficult, money scarce, the Cold War divisions too entrenched. But she kept Dorothy's letters, Ruth's seeds, replanted yearly, their offspring still growing in her small garden, Robert Callahan's photograph, and her notebooks filled with memories of Lebanon. When she died in 1998, at the age of 83, her obituary in the Dresden newspaper was brief. Greta Hoffmann, beloved teacher, died peacefully. She dedicated her life to education and reconciliation, believing that peace is built one person, one choice, one moment of kindness at a time. At her funeral, one of her former students, now a gray-haired professor himself, read from Greta's notebooks, the pages yellowed but the words still clear. "I learned in Lebanon, Missouri, that enemies can break bread together, that mercy is possible even when not deserved, that hope can survive even the deepest darkness. I spent my life trying to pass that lesson forward. I pray it was enough." The garden behind the school where Greta had first taught after the war still bloomed every spring, tended now by new generations of students who didn't know the full story but maintained the tradition. And somewhere in Lebanon, Missouri, in a cemetery behind a white church, A small headstone marked Dorothy's grave, carved beneath her name and dates. She taught that education is teaching humanity. She showed that former enemies can become friends. Peace, as Greta had always said, is built person by person. Not perfectly, not quickly, but persistently, hopefully, one seed at a time. Thank you for listening to the story of Greta Hoffmann and her unexpected journey to Lebanon, Missouri, during the final days of World War II. This tale reminds us that even in our darkest historical moments, individual acts of kindness can bridge seemingly unbridgeable divides. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more narratives exploring the complex humanity within historical events. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss future stories about ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances, about the difficult work of reconciliation, and about how hope persists even in the ruins of war. Share this story with someone who appreciates thoughtful historical fiction, and leave a comment telling us what moment resonated most with you. Was it Ruth Seed's? Robert Callahan's photograph? The classroom scene? Your thoughts help us understand what stories matter to you. Remember Greta's lesson. Peace is built person by person, choice by choice, moment by moment. Subscribe today and join us in exploring more stories of humanity's resilience, complexity, and capacity for redemption. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.